Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Virtually Speaking, a Columbia Nursing webinar series. My name is Janice Grady. I'm the Assistant Dean for Development and Alumni Relations. This afternoon's program is Columbia Nursing, A Brief History, and it will focus on the three transformative periods of the school's history: the heroic age of its founding under the leadership of Maxwell as the Presbyterian Hospital Training School, its lengthy and torturous road to a university affiliation in the 1920s and 30s, and its trials, tribulations, and finally rebirth in the 1980s and 90s. Before starting, just a few housekeeping items. Please note that everyone except our speakers is muted. Kindly utilize the chat feature located at the bottom of your screen if you have any questions or comments that come up during the presentation, and we will address them at the end. Lastly, thank you in advance for your patience if any technical difficulties arise. Our intention is for all to go smoothly. It is now my pleasure to introduce Suzanne Law Hawes, graduate of the class of 1959. She is a Dean and Professor Emerita from the School of Health Professions at William Patterson College and a Peace Corps volunteer. Sue has been an instrumental force in keeping the history of our school alive. Welcome, Sue.
Thank you, Janice, and hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. And Janice has already mentioned that I was a member of the graduate coterie, graduating in 1959. I taught at the school in the 60s and was president of the Columbia University Presbyterian Hospital School of Nursing for 12 years and the first Anna Caroline Maxwell awardee. I was so pleased to be asked to introduce Steve for this vital program about the history of our school from 1892 to the present and how it became a university program. As you know, I've been interested in our history for many years, and have this program streamed so that it can be viewed by many delights me no end. Having worked with Steve over many years, I found him to be a wonderful font of information about its school and its history. We worked together for the restoration of the Florence Nightingale's notes on nursing that had suffered water damage, the digitization of the Alumni Quarterly and later the Alumni magazine, so that the years from 1906, when the first quarterly magazine came out, until the 1950s, it is now available for all to access on the internet. Go to www.archive.org to see it. Steve has been the head of the Archives and Special Collections at Long Library of Health Sciences since 1997. The repository which he oversees contains the holdings of the Columbia University Medical Center from 1767 to the present. It has 27,000 volumes of rare books relating to the health sciences from the 15th to the 20th century, including manuscripts and personal papers, the Freud Library, the Florence Nightingale collection, and a large photo collection. Having been there, it's an amazing place, and it's an awesome responsibility that he fills admirably. Steve also served as the archivist for the Juilliard School, as well as the New York State Office of Libraries and Record Management, and other similar positions at New York Hospital Cornell Medical Center, the New York Historical Society, to name a few. He is well qualified to be the leader of this large and fascinating collection. Steve has a master's in history from NYU in archival management and history editing, and a history major, a graduate at Rutgers. I found out recently we both graduated on the same day. He has had many presentations, awards, and publications. Never an idle man. So please, Steve, tell us the history that we should know.
Thank you, Sue, for that generous introduction. I'm going to share my screen now. And so thank you again to Janice and Sharon for inviting me to give this talk. Before I start, I should say that the views expressed are entirely my own and do not necessarily reflect those of Columbia University or the School of Nursing. I'm also somewhat awed and intimidated by the fact that we've had 3 excellent histories of the School of Nursing written in the past 125 years. 2 of them were written by Eleanor Lee, who many of you know later became dean of the school, one in 1942 for the 50th anniversary and another in 1967 for the 75th. And then in 1992, Gary Goldenberg wrote Nurses of a Different Stripe. These are all excellent histories. There are probably few American schools of nursing that have had such a good historical writing devoted to it. I can only touch on what Janice mentioned, 3 kind of transformative periods in the history of the school. If you want to know more, I heartily recommend these books. I suspect many of these you have in your library. So yes, it all begins with Florence Nightingale. So there were nurses before Nightingale, particularly Catholic nursing orders, but there was really no nursing profession that was outside of these religious orders. And of course, in Protestant countries where they did not have nursing orders, there was none at all. And as a matter of fact, a kind of a stereotypical pre-Nightingale nurse is this person, Mrs. Gamp. She's a character in Charles Dickens' Martin Chuzzlewit of 1843. She has her own Wikipedia page, believe it or not, and where she's described as being dissolute, sloppy, and generally drunk. This is an illustration from a later edition of the Dickens work. So this is the kind of thing that Nightingale was facing, and why her family was horrified that she wanted to become a nurse. The formative text, which I'm sure many of you know, is Notes on Nursing. That happened. Sorry. Can people hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, so it keeps saying I'm muted. It was a bestseller. It sold 15,000 copies in 1 year, and this is a work on nursing. And that very same year, an American edition is published in New York. Okay. I'm sorry, I can't. Why am I not? I'm stuck. Oh, okay. Nightingale is also responsible for establishing the first modern school of nursing, which is now the Nightingale School of Nursing, part of King's College, University College London. It opens in 1860. This is its present building. The first US schools are a little later, about a dozen years later, and 3 were founded in that same year, 1873. Bellevue, which is now the Hunter College School of Nursing, the hospital, the New Haven Hospital, and at Mass General Hospital in Boston. So here in New York Hospital starts a school in 1877, but Presbyterian, which is founded in 1872 or opens in 1872, is a little late to the game. And I suspect part of this has to do with they had this disastrous fire in 1889 that destroyed both their surgical and medical wards. So they spent a couple of years rebuilding. But in 1892, they finally decide they need a school of nursing. And this is what I call the birth certificate of the School of Nursing. It's the original announcement. It is the only copy I've ever found of this. And I found this stuffed in a scrapbook of stuff that we got from the School of Nursing when they moved to their present building. I've got to salute the School of Nursing. They did not throw a lot of things out. I've not found this anyplace else. It's interesting to read a bit. So it starts out saying that the applicant must be prepared for an examination in reading, penmanship, simple arithmetic, and English dictation. This amount of education is indispensable, that's italicized, but applicants are reminded that all things being equal, women of superior education and culture will be preferred. So you see the reaction against the Mrs. Gamps of the previous generation of nurses. It goes on to say that the hours of duty are 7 o'clock to 7 o'clock. Reasonable time will be allowed for study, exercise and rest, although when they were supposed to sleep, I have no idea. And then it goes on to say that when the full term of 2 years is ended, the nurses will be at liberty to choose their own field of labor. And of course, in this time, most went into private duty nursing. But I think that kind of hints at a reason why women would want to become nurses. It gave them independence. They could make their own way in the world. They were a professional and they could make good money at it. And that was not something a lot of women could do back then. There were only a few fields open to women, I should say. So the person they hired to start this, of course, is Anna C. Maxwell. She's born in upstate New York in 1851 to a Scottish immigrant father and a native-born American of old New England stock. She is, however, mostly raised in Canada. And later on, it was said that she tended to be favorable to Canadian applicants over American applicants. She thought Canadian girls were better than American girls. She's trained at the Boston City Hospital School of Nursing, and then she has an early position at Montreal General Hospital, which was not successful. But then she's, after some time in Europe, she comes back and runs the program at Massachusetts General. And then in 1889 is recruited by St. Luke's Hospital here in the city. So 3 years later, the Presbyterian kind of poaches her from St. Luke's. She does have a rather reputation as being, I think, formidable. But one thing that comes across, and many people mentioned at her death, was that, as one person said, she was a person of unusual personal charm. And I think to be as successful as she wasn't just hardworking and smart. She also was able to be charming when she needed to be. So who were the students? Very few of the early applications survive. Unfortunately, this is one thing the School of Nursing did not keep. I know from a note in these records that they threw out most of them in the late 60s, but this is one that survives. It's Georgia W. Bellinger of Elizabeth, New Jersey, and it has questions that we would ask today. They ask about their health, they ask about their height, how much they weigh, their date of birth and place, but they ask if they're single. They ask what their religion is and what church they belong to. They ask if they're married. All of this would draw an HR professional now would cringe in horror at this, but in 1889 or whatever it is, 1893, this would not be a problem. She actually was a member of the class of 98. The students at this point are all women. Men do not become nurses. They are all white, although it's not specified. There is no African-American student until the early 50s. And they're generally what we would call Yankees back then. That is, they are of old American stock and Protestant. Nursing education in this period is very siloed by religion. So Catholic girls went to Catholic hospital schools, Jewish girls went to Jewish hospitals, Protestants went to Protestant hospitals. That breaks down by the 30s, but it's still very prevalent even in the post-war years. So what did they learn? Yes, there's a really rigorous training here. I'm sorry this is so small, but it's from the catalog for the 1896-97 year. And it shows the hygiene of the sick room, outlines of bacteriology, which is a new field in the 1890s, anatomy, general medical nursing, surgical lectures, principles of modern surgery, materia medica. The second year, at this point, it's a 2-year program. They study gynecology, surgical emergencies, nutrition, care of the insane, nursing and the diseases of the skin. So this is more than you would get probably at a good women's college at the time in some ways, if you had gone to Vassar or Mount Holyoke. It's pretty demanding, I would say. But of course, they mostly work on the wards. So they work in the emergency room, which is seen here. This is the children's ward, decorated for Christmas. They work with the infants. They do things like prepare cotton balls. They do public health nursing. This is at the New York Diet Kitchen, which was a private charitable organization. And of course, they work in the OR. That's Anna Maxwell all the way on the right. So when I was younger, I thought 12 years was a really long period of time. Now that I'm a person of a certain age, 12 years seems to go by like that. So it's really amazing how much Anna Maxwell got accomplished in 12 years. Besides just starting a school, she did much more. This is the first graduating class of 1894. Well, one thing is she designed the uniform, although I'm afraid those leg of mutton sleeves seem to have been phased out fairly early. They only show up in the photos of the first couple of years. She actually went and had the cloth specially made in Scotland, and that was what the uniforms were made of until 1939, when the outbreak of World War II made getting them in from the United Kingdom impossible. In 1898, she persuades the hospital administration to extend the course to 3 years, so even more teaching. Here she is teaching a class. She heads a group of nurses that goes down to Georgia to treat the sick and injured of the Spanish-American War at Camp Thomas in Chickamauga Park in 1898, I believe this is. She starts a visiting nurse service at New York at Presbyterian Hospital in 1904, which had graduate nurses, but also this is where student nurses trained. And this is the origin of the social service department at what's now New York Presbyterian Hospital, which is one of the oldest in the country, although not the oldest. And maybe most significantly of all, she gets the first School of Nursing building constructed, Florence Nightingale Hall, which opens in 1904. They did not spare expense on this building. This is the nurses' lounge, and I mean, look at that beautiful woodwork. This was not an inexpensive building. The student rooms are a little bit more Spartan, but still fairly, large and probably comfortable, and certainly a great improvement over the previous housing, which was in the attic of the medical and surgical wards of the hospital, which could not have been very comfortable at all. Beyond 1904, she does things like co-authors the leading textbook of nursing, Practical Nursing, the first edition of which is 1907. It's co-authored with Amy Pope, class of 1894. She's very involved in Army nursing during World War I. This is her paying a visit to the Presbyterian Hospital based in Étretat, France. And as many of you probably know, after the war, she was one of the nurses who lobbied the U.S. Army to start the U.S. Army Nursing Corps, which was established, I think, in 1920 or so. This entitled her to be buried at Arlington National Cemetery, where you can still see her a tombstone. This is a photo from a couple of years ago. So my next kind of highlight is the transition to university school. This was very much in keeping with what other schools were doing. It's happening at New York Hospital School of Nursing, which a little later becomes part of Cornell University, Hopkins, Yale, things like that. However, and I think Gary Goldenberg has a really good chapter on this. This was a long and torturous process. And partly this is because there's a bewildering number of what we might be called dramatis personae that were all involved in this. So you have two presidents of Presbyterian Hospital, William Sloan. After his early death, he's replaced by Dean Sage, who was there for 20 years. On the Columbia side, you have William Darack, who's dean throughout the 20s. And then he's succeeded by Willard Rapoli. At the School of Nursing itself, Anna Maxwell is involved in the very early stages of this. And then the baton is passed to Helen Young, who's director, or we call dean, until 1937. But also there's a little matter of this campus being superseded by this campus. the creation of really what is the world's first medical center, a gigantic undertaking, gigantic in its planning, gigantic in its fundraising, gigantic in its construction. It took everybody's attention for a whole decade. I love this photo. You'll see on the upper left-hand corner that the New York pier of the George Washington Bridge is still not quite complete. So this is probably 1929. And of course, the School of Nursing is also involved in this. And I love this fundraising brochure. The date of the first move has been set, and the 500, I think, is they were looking to raise $500 from each class or something like that. And then they are speeding along in the Fifth Avenue double-decker bus, which went up Fort Washington Avenue and then Broadway up to the new medical center, because of course they're building Anna Maxwell Hall. So it's not as if all these parties are not involved with a lot of other things. And there is the big question, of course, of, and I think Goldenberg lays this out pretty convincingly, is that Dean Sage, the president of Presbyterian Hospital, was concerned that he was losing what it was an inexpensive source of labor. That is, student nurses worked on the wards, and if they were too busy in the classroom, they'd have to hire more graduate nurses, and they would cost more. I will say Presbyterian Hospital did a terrible job of keeping its records. Basically, they've kept almost none of them except for the bound volumes. Fortunately, the School of Nursing did keep material. And also, we, of course, have in the archives here, we have the Columbia University side of this story because we have the records of the Vice President for Health Sciences. This is just one of an unbelievable torrent of voluminous correspondence that documents this transition. And this is a letter from Helen Young to Dean Sage. It's 3 pages. I'm only showing you the first and the end. And what I love is that Anna Maxwell, who's at this point 4 years Dean Emeritus, scrolls at the bottom that she approves Anna Maxwell, late Director, School of Nursing. She was still very much involved with the school, even though she was no longer running it. So there was, and of course, with everything, there's money involved. And this is more a Columbia thing. So this was a projected cost for salaries for 36-37. Actually, it doesn't open until the next year. And this is only the first page. It actually comes to about $41,000 in 1936 money for all the instructors. You'll notice that the dean, the director, who's also a professor, they didn't call them deans and they called them executive officers, has a salary of $3,500 a year. That's actually quite a comfortable salary for the Depression, when $10,000 was something that a small town bank director would make and would live quite lavishly. But in early 1937, it is finally announced that the school will become affiliated with Columbia University. This being the 30s, the New York Times covered it because they covered everything in the 1930s. It's really amazing. So it set up that the new division will give bachelor's degree. However, it's a somewhat ambivalent status. The first article in the Columbia Alumni Journal doesn't show up until 1940. This is from the April 1940 alumni magazine for Columbia, and they talk about its newest school. It only happened 3 years before, but they're finally getting around to it. And the announcement, it's the Department of Nursing of the College of Physicians and Surgeons, but also the Presbyterian Hospital School of Nursing. So this was not unusual, and it shows its kind of hybrid status. It's both a hospital school and a university school. Neither side of this completely controls it. So there is, however, a new curriculum, and there's now a BA/BS degree. Before that, they only gave out diplomas. For those who already had a BS or a BA, they could do the program in 2 years and 3 months and would receive a second baccalaureate degree and a diploma from Presbyterian Hospital. For those who had 2 years of college, it would take them 3 years to finish the new curriculum. They would receive a BS from Columbia and a diploma from Presbyterian. And for those who just had a high school degree, again, it would be 3 years, but they would only receive a diploma. After an initial term the BS and the diploma students were taught separately. Margaret E. Conrad is the first director. At that point, they separated out the directorship of the hospital nursing and the school. Helen Young is head of nursing at Presbyterian until 1942, and then they are re-merged together. And she again wears, Conrad wears both the hat of dean of the school and director of nursing at the hospital. Again, something that now is out of date, but was very common for schools of nursing then. This is the first class to graduate any baccalaureate degrees. It's the class of 1940. There were 84 graduates. Of those, 13 received the BS degree in nursing. But over time, the number of BS candidates grows and grows. So, third part of this is the challenges of the 80s and 90s. And there are a whole number of issues facing both the school, nursing education in general, New York City, and the medical center. So one is there's aging infrastructure. So by the late 1970s, Presbyterian is still operating on the ward system that is really obsolete by that point, where most hospitals, newer hospital buildings, are doing the private or semi-private rooms. Really nobody wants to be in a ward anymore. There is financial distress. Both the university and the hospital depended greatly on endowment income. And of course, you may remember the 1970s is the era of stagflation. That is soaring prices and also a stagnant economy, and especially a stagnant stock market, which affected endowment income greatly. For Columbia, the 1970s is a decade of rebuilding after the student riot of 1968, in which the administration managed to alienate just about every class, whether they were old or young. There's the decline of New York City, which has multiple causes. And of course, it's not just really confined to New York. All of the older Northeastern cities have problems in the 70s, but they were particularly bad in New York, which of course, many of you may remember went bankrupt in 1975. And then there's a very local issue in that there's a soaring local murder rate. Just to give you an example, between 1970 and 1980, the murder rate in New York City as a whole rose 56%, which may sound pretty appalling, but for the same decade in the 33rd Police Precinct, which then stretched from 155th Street all the way to the tip of Manhattan, the murder rate rose 218%. This is not a neighborhood people really want to come to. Even as late as 1991, the 33rd Police Precinct had 119 murders. Amazingly, by 1998, it's down to 5. So there's all that. We recently found this photo. It is now the Mary Lasker Research Pavilion. It's the old Audubon Ballroom. And this is what it looked like about 1980. It is boarded up. It is covered with graffiti. And what I really love about this is if you see the panel truck in the middle turning onto 165th Street, even it has graffiti on it. A reminder of the good old days of New York City and what this neighborhood was once like. Kind of symbolic of all this for the School of Nursing is the demolition of Maxwell Hall to make way for Milstein Hospital Pavilion. They needed to build a new patients building. That was absolutely crucial if Presbyterian was going to continue. And I would say that maybe in the long run, this was a blessing in disguise, and that it freed up the school administration to think innovatively about where nursing education could go. Because a lot of things are they leave, Maxwell is demolished, they moved to Georgian, which is an apartment building built in the 1920s. It was not really an ideal space for education, but it remains the School of Nursing building for, 30 years or so. So Between 1977 and 1985, there's a 57% decline in undergraduate enrollment at the School of Nursing, partly due to the proliferation of associate and BS nursing programs in state schools, which are a lot less expensive. It's a bad time for university-affiliated schools of nursing. Cornell shuts down in 1979 after 102 years of being in operation. Bellevue spins off its school to Hunter College, which it still survives. And even as late as 1988, Boston University, which is a really excellent school of nursing, closes its school. And Columbia was, they closed the School of Library Service in 1992, the first and oldest school of library service in the United States. They say it's because they're not productive enough academically, although I can't help but think the fact that both schools, most of its graduates were women, and women don't have income as large as men graduates, and they're not, they can't kind of ante up when they have those alumni drives. But Columbia, they closed the School of Library Service for, quote, lack of research agenda. And that was the other thing that they were concerned about with the School of Nursing. But there is a turnaround, and it happens under the deanship of Mary Mundiger. I will say when she comes in as acting dean in 1984, things do look rather grim. By the time she leaves in 2010, Columbia the nursing school is thriving and is considered like a star of the medical center. Obviously, she couldn't have done it on her own. And I just want to mention one person, this person who probably nobody's heard of, Henrik Bendixen, who was vice president for health sciences and dean of the medical school from 1984 to 89. The previous provost, Robert Goldberger, as I think Gary Goldenberg quite accurately describes, was actively hostile to the School of Nursing. He really just felt it needed to be shut down. Bendixen, on the other hand, thought it was going to be a wonderful resource. So Mundiger starts out with an ally rather than an antagonist, and this makes a huge difference. If you've ever wondered why there's an endowed professorship in this man's name, this is why. So Mundiger does something that was a little shocking at the time. She is the first, she makes Columbia the first nursing school to require the faculty to establish either a clinical practice or a research program. And this was not always, I don't think it was welcome maybe by all the faculty at the time, but it happened, and it made a huge difference in the direction the school went. The clinical practice leads to the establishment of the Columbia Advanced Practice Nurse Associates in 1997. One thing is, with the decline of the four-year baccalaureate program, there's the creation of the Entry to Practice program for non-RN baccalaureate holders, which is very popular, especially with people wanting to start a new career after having worked in another career earlier in their life. You get a much more diverse group of students than you would have had, say, 20 years before. But what's really interesting is the rise of doctoral education. The founding of the Doctor of Medical Science degree in 1994. 10 years later, they established the Doctor of Nursing Practice. And then 4 years after that, there's the Nursing PhD program is established. And again, Columbia is not the only school to do this, but it is in the first rank of schools establishing these kinds of programs. Another thing that I can only really kind of touch on where it was Columbia's really strong master's program in specialties. So the nurse midwife program, the MA program, was the first clinical master's program established in a U.S. School of Nursing. It goes back to 1956. And it's still among the master's specialty programs. The other program that was innovative was the psychiatric mental health nursing program established in the early 60s. Many of you will know that's Penelope Bushman, who's given us some of her papers. I keep waiting for her to give us the rest of her papers, but she's still working, I think, so I have to wait. and I will say a lovely person. So the other thing I think that's just remarkable compared to 30 years ago is the rise in research at the School of Nursing. And if you had told Robert Goldberger that this could happen in 1984, he probably would have said, I don't believe you. But recently, the school has been ranked 4th among schools of nursing, and NIH funding for the last 2 years, ranked 1st among schools of nursing, and the AHRQ funding for the last 5 years or so, and received $14.8 million in federal and non-federal funds awarded in the fiscal year 2020. Again, this is impressive, I think, speaking as a non-nurse. The other thing, of course, that all of you know is that the new building opened in 2017. And for anybody who ever had to go into the Georgian building, I once said to somebody, one of the administrators I was working with, I said, it's like they're trying to punish you by putting in these spaces. They were such a warren of rooms with like weird kitchens and bathrooms. And I was like, how can you work in this space? But anybody who's been in the new building knows that that's not the case. It is an amazingly kind of simpatico working space and teaching space. And it looks great when it's lit up at night too. I think everybody would agree. So I just want to invite people to, well, when we finally reopen to non-Columbia people at least, to visit us at Archives and Special Collections. We are the holder of what we now call the Auchincloss Florence Nightingale collection, which many of you will remember. We've named it Auchincloss after the main donor of the collection. We have a huge amount of School of Nursing records now. We have Dean's records going back into the 1940s. We do have some fragments of student records. We have scrapbooks. We have an amazing collection of photos that goes back to the 1890s, probably. We have some wonderful personal papers of student, graduates. And of course, we have a complete set of the Alumni magazine, and that was recently digitized with funding from the Columbia University Presbyterian Hospital School of Nursing Alumni Association. That is an amazing resource, not only for the history of this School of Nursing, but for the history of American nursing in general. Whenever I have a researcher who wants to know more about, say, international nursing or rural nursing, it's like, you need to look at alumni journals, because people wrote letters to them in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and they're remarkable documents. These were very articulate women working at places across the country and around the world. So I'm gonna now turn the mic back to Sue, who's going to talk about this from an alumni perspective, and I hope doesn't chastise me too severely for the things I missed. Sue?
Yes, thank you, Steve.
Oh,
that was very interesting and brought back so many memories from years ago. I do have a few little corrections, if I might, before I launch into my few minutes. You notice with the early curriculum, all of the lectures were given by physicians. Of course, they didn't teach the nursing arts, but that tradition continued through the 60s and 70s, because the nurses were not really prepared to talk about diseases in any length. Also, the BS students did join with the high school and two-year students in their classes. I'm a living, breathing example to know that our nursing arts in the 60s, where we had 161 beginning students, they were a mix of all three levels. So I'd like to also show to you, and I hope you can see it. Steve mentioned this, And it is Anna Maxwell's, Eleanor Lee's first book that she printed in 1942 on the history of the School of Nursing. Out of print, but valuable. I don't know whether it's on archive.org, but it should be. And then her later volume that Steve also mentioned is Neighbors, and it is about the history of the Department of Nursing and its predecessors. And that was done in 1967 after Eleanor Lee retired. So I would like to augment Steve's wonderful presentation and talk about the nurses who were involved in all of this transition. He has focused on the school becoming an outstanding university graduate program. And I would like to focus on the nurses and programs that helped to make the school a leader in the profession. When Anna Maxwell started the program, as Steve has indicated, she wanted smart, capable women to care for the sick, not to carry gowns. It wasn't easy in those days to recruit women with the interest in doing this kind of labor. And yet Mary McGoon Brown, who was a very early graduate in, I believe, 1894, whose grandfather started Brown Brothers Bank, was one of the early students and continued in clinical practice as a nurse in her entire life. In 1895, believe it or not, a physician graduated from the school. And over the next decade, more and more college graduates completed the basic program. And ever after, there seems to have been college graduates at every level of the program, taking the basic preparation to become nurses. They are not as, we're not as diverse as today's graduate students coming into the entry into practice program, but they certainly were a small cadre to help point the way for where nursing should go. To demonstrate the thrust of Anna's intention to train nursing students to think, as Steve had mentioned, just 15 years after she started the program, Practical Nursing was published. And I have a few fun photos from that volume. The first, and I hope you can see it, and if you're a newer graduate, you probably don't even know what this mechanism is. It's called a colon irrigation. Take a look at the size of those tanks that nurses had to lug in and out filled with water. No small task. Then there's another picture in that same volume that, believe it or not, before antibiotics and respiratory therapy came on the scene, there is the Mawes inhaler, which is a steam sort of water pipe that were given to patients who had chest congestion to help release that phlegm. At any rate, the Maxwell system of educating nurses captured worldwide attention. In 1909, a Danish woman graduated, Charlotte Monk, who returned home to head their new nursing school. She took the Maxwell program, uniform and practical nursing book with her, translated it into Danish, and helped to transform nursing in Europe, modeled after the Maxwell program. There have been many outstanding graduates over the decades. To look further upon those upon whose shoulders you now stand, see the Distinguished Alumni Awards listed in the school's website. It began in 1977 and showcases alumni over our long history. And this is a volume that I put together that shows people from the very beginning who were nominated for this award. While those alumni were cited, there were many, many more of that same ilk that have not been so credited. However, they helped as mightily as did these distinguished nursing graduates. While the doctors and administrators supported the nursing program, they did not develop and evaluate and improve its curricular offerings. The faculty, nursing faculty, did it. And it is upon those nurses that helped shape the program for what it has become today. Because of the excellence of the program over the years, graduates were hired almost immediately as supervisors, directors, teachers, and deans. Graduates have served in every war since the 1890s, when Steve mentioned they served in the Spanish-American War. And through Anna Maxwell's efforts, she obtained officer status for her graduates, and they continue to serve their country in the military as officers. While the planning to become a university-sponsored school was supported by Helen Young and Margaret Conrad beginning in the 1930s, it wasn't until 1958 that all students were Columbia graduates. For many years, the school was a department under the Faculty of Medicine, as the nurse faculty did not have sufficient academic credentials to qualify for professorships. Steve did mention that some of the early administrators were granted professorships, perhaps to keep them in more aligned with other schools at Columbia University. But it wasn't until around World War II that they went for advanced education. In the 1950s, the first nurse faculty member to be married was Harriet Deluran. And it wasn't until the 1960s that Dorothy Riley was the first faculty member to obtain a doctoral degree, and students were allowed to marry. How far we have come. The midwifery program that Steve cited and the number of graduate programs today that followed were added over time, and now there are 12 different advanced practice programs at the graduate level. Changes in the Nurse Practice Acts also added to the impetus for nurses to continue their education. Before the 1950s, there were no advanced clinical programs for nursing. A succession of deans over the years since Conrad's time have improved and expanded nursing education at our school. Helen Pettit, Elizabeth Gill, and Mary Mundiger, who helped our school survive in very lean times when other programs closed. The demolition of Maxwell Hall in the 1980s and changing program format had also a major impact on the school and program. A word about what was going on in nursing in those years. Paramount has been the need for more education. Unlike doctors that get paid for their intern and resident years, nurses are expected to practice immediately after graduation and licensure examination. Herein lies an underlying conflict with joining an academic institution. With the need for a baccalaureate degree and programming that was required, the extensive clinical hours that the hospital schools provided was shortened to allow for students to be full-fledged college students. Now, new graduates need mentorships in their first clinical position so that they can gain sufficient clinical skills to practice. Might I add that the cost for the program rose as a proportion of preparation was university-based. Originally, students paid a $70 entrance fee and no cost for living expenses, books, uniforms, laundry was required of them. Their labor did more than pay the hospital back for their investment. In 1937 and 38, the application fee, the first year tuition was $150. And 4 sessions with the university were between $50 and $60, not a credit, but for the course. The course in the 60s, a comprehensive university fee was increased to $100, along with varying tuition rates. I won't belabor you with all of the intervening years, but there was a neat little chart that I found about the rise of tuition from these bare bone beginning to almost the current day. This ends in 1819. And so the costs have changed from 0809 from $37,000 plus to 1819 to $56,600 and even more today. So to become a nurse today is a costly undertaking, but I am always amazed at the background of the students entering the school. They are cognizant of the cost, but they want something more from their lives prior to coming. And some of them have had some amazing experiences in a multiplicity of fields. With the changes in providing health needs of our society, more and more of our graduates are taking their place in primary care, and they are well prepared to do so. I would expect to see this movement grow even greater. It has origins a long time ago because places like the Kentucky Nursing Service also did this same kind of a thing and provided primary care to the rural residents of Kentucky. And here we are now, some almost 80 years later, returning to our origins of what we do best. I am proud to be a graduate of this remarkable school. Like all history buffs, I also hope that what has come before will be known and has relevance to the future development of the school and its program. All of the outstanding graduates have had a part in making the school what it is today. We have come a long way and the future is bright. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. I'll now open the floor up for discussion and questions for a few minutes. No questions? Sue and I have stunned you into silence.
Well, I really would like to comment further about the archives. I would urge, not all at once, because it's a very small space and Steve unfortunately has limited staff, but I was able to find a third great uncle who was a student at P&S in the 1800s. And that to me was remarkable. And his help in getting archive.org, please write that web page down. It's an invaluable resource for our school. And Steve he didn't help, he put it up with the help of the old Alumni Association. And as he said, the letters that people wrote from India, from China, from South America are amazing. I interviewed one 1930 graduate, and she went to Columbia, South Carolina, South America, to do nursing and midwifery. She asked Virginia Apgar to teach her what she needed to know. And when I spoke to her many years later, after her labors in Columbia, she said that she had delivered over 1,000 babies and never lost any. And her basic instruments was a pair of scissors, a bowl, and the help of the family, because it was all done at home. It's an amazing story that sometimes we don't get to see. So enough of my tirade there, Steve.